defendant that I couldn't be.
I gotta check Byron Blake out, man.
Well, first
this
of all,
is his
what's
YouTube
the
channel.
sentencing
Breaking down
range? The
Big Meech,
defendant, 30
paperwork.
to life.
Right here.
The court.
Y'all see it? Go on
And on
YouTube
the basis
and
of the
check this out,
guidelines,
man. He
the
breaks the
defendant,
paperwork
right.
down better than anybody,
The court.
bro.
That's a
This shit
recommended.
real.
The
Big
defendant,
Meech
right.
is big street.
The court.
Big
And that takes into
snitch.
account your criminal
Big
history and the
bitch.
nature of your offenses. The defendant, right.
I don't give a fuck. You
The
can't.
court. And there's a minimum, right? The defendant,
Wow.
30. The court, 20 years, right? Mr. Eisen, which happens to be the prosecutor. That's by statute, Your Honor. The court, yes, by law. But there's also a provision in the agreement, isn't there? That I can't.
Y'all gotta watch
At
Byron
this point,
Blake, man. This cat.
Meech's
he
attorney
broke down
immediately
he
interjects.
busted,
as soon as the government begins
1090
to
Jakes.
talk about the
This cat
provision
breaking
and the court
down
begins to talk about the
paperwork. He the
provision,
coldest at it, man.
Meech's attorney immediately interjects.
he-
He doesn't
he
want that
better than
part
Mickey the
to
Truth.
go on the record. No, the agreement is that the guidelines are 30 to life, but, and then the judge stopped him and says, let me do it. He said, okay, I'm sorry. Now, it's important to note that during this segment of the hearing, the judge has established that Meech has entered into a plea agreement and that his statutory guidelines range was 30 to life. For those who don't know what a statutory guidelines range is, the United States Federal Sentencing Guidelines are rules published by the United States Sentencing Commission that set out a uniform policy for sentencing individuals and organizations convicted of felonies and serious Class A misdemeanors in the United States federal court system. Now, let's continue. Court, you know that's why I took the job. However, the court must impose a sentence of imprisonment on count 3 of at least 20 years. Mr. Feinberg, yes. The court, that's a provision of the agreement, right? Mr. Feinberg, yes. The defendant, on both counts. The court, well, I understand, but there is a provision that I have to give you at least 20 years. The defendant, right. The court, and if I don't, the government can withdraw from this deal? The defendant, right. Now, right here, the judge has documented another portion of Meech's plea agreement with the government.
Wow.
So we now know that based on this provision that Meech has, his guideline range is 30 to life. And there is an agreement with the government that the judge must give him at least 20 years or the government can back out. Let's continue. The court. Okay, when you go to prison, after you get out, there's a period of supervised release. The defendant, yes. The court, right? The defendant, yes. There is also a $200 special assessment, right? The defendant, yes. And I can impose a fine on either count up to $250,000, right? The defendant, yes. And if I let you withdraw your plea for any reason, they can use these statements made here today against you, right? The defendant, I guess, yes. The court, okay. And there is also a forfeiture, but there is nothing specific set forth in the forfeiture, right? The defendant, right. And if I accept this agreement and we go forward, any other charges against you are dismissed, right? The defendant, yes. And if we don't exceed what the agreement says, you have no right to appeal, right? The defendant, right. And if it should turn out that your criminal history is different than that which you have all agreed upon,
hold on, I want y'all
I can go higher, right?
You
But
just
you
talking
can't
about
get
this
out
part.
of it.
It's the next one.
Here?
Boom, right here.
Yeah. I don't know how I can go higher because I think that there is a provision, is there not? Mr. Leibson, who was the other prosecuting attorney, would chime in and say,
Wait, where's it at? He go in right here.
his guideline range was 30 to life. He then...
Introducing Domino's Best Deal Ever. Get
Hold on.
any pizza
I
with
want
any
y'all to
toppings
watch
for
this.
just $9.99
Check
online.
this shit,
Your
man. It's
favorite
foul,
pizza.
bro.
Those with Robin
He
Hood Gold
foul,
can enjoy
man.
a 3%
Y'all gotta check
IRA
out Byron
match.
Blake's YouTube channel, man.
Tremendous.
He then made an agreement with the
Look, he
government,
made an
and
agreement
based on
with
that
them.
agreement, he would plead guilty. And in exchange, the court would not be able to give him less than 20 years, but the government would agree to seek no more than 30 years. We also learned that there is a provision that would allow for Meech to get more than 30 years, but based on his agreement, that provision was moot. Now let's break down what this means. A guidelines range of 30 to life means Meech can get no less than 30 years if convicted. By entering into this plea agreement, Meech was turning his minimum of 30 years into his maximum and lowering his minimum down to 20 years. This signifies that Meech made an agreement with the government for a downward departure. If you don't know what a downward departure is when the federal judge imposes a defendant a sentence that is lower than the minimum sentence that was suggested by the sentencing guidelines.
A downward
Now,
departure.
Not every downward departure is bad. As I just mentioned, it usually happens when a judge deviates from the guidelines because you may have been less involved than others or may have some special circumstances like a learning disability or something. The judge might just feel the sentence is too steep, but the government agreeing to a downward departure signifies that a defendant has cooperated or assisted in some way. Before we move forward, I want to demonstrate to you all the types of games that the courts play. If you look at Meech's actual plea agreement on paper, you will see that there is a difference in the terms that are shown